Here's something that's more on the side of funny and weird than anything else. Not a major undertaking, but a bit of a laugh. Let's have a look at a couple of really quite terrible matches from the annals of ProRes. In particular, from the archives of the most famous company in all of ProRes. Yes, it's a New Japan video. For the most part, anyway. Here's 3 pretty hideous matches that you may not know all that well, and even if you do know them, you may not know the story behind them. One of these matches does actually take place outside of a New Japan ring, in America, but the context behind it means that it absolutely counts. Anyway, let's begin. So these days, New Japan usually isn't associated with terrible matches. Sure, there may be the odd bad one here and there. They might want you to forget that time they brought a bunch of Gracies in, for example. But generally, New Japan is good times. But as you folks know already, that was not always the case. For the match that is generally regarded as the worst to ever take place in a New Japan ring, we actually have to go to a time when the company was damn popular for a bout, or really a succession of bouts, that have the mark of good old Antonio Inoki lined all the way through them. The 1995 January the 4th Dome show, known as Battle 7, alongside a damn stacked card featuring all sorts of marquee matches, Hashimoto vs Sasaki, Steiners vs Hase and Muta, all sorts, featured a one-night tournament called Final Countdown BVD. Final Countdown being the name given to what basically became Inoki's 3-year-long retirement tour, and BVD being one of New Japan's main sponsors at the time. They're a brand of men's underwear, by the way. This one-night 4-man tournament features one of the weirdest lineups in wrestling tournament history, an almost unexplainable selection of people. How weird? Well, the first match features that man called Stin, who needs no introduction, being one of WCW's top stars and all. Now, surely the biggest New Japan show of the year would have Stin against someone equally over and talented. Masahiro Chono, maybe? Hell, even someone like Hiro Saito? No. Stin's opponent is some guy named Tony Palmore. So, who on earth was Tony Palmore? Well, he was a kickboxer from Miami, a thoroughly legit badass one too, a multiple-time gold medalist and heavyweight champion, back in the 1970s. His credentials in kickboxing are undoubted, even if they happened some time ago, but does he have any pro wrestling experience? None whatsoever. And here he is, making his pro wrestling debut in an MMA rules match against Stin, a guy who's a total pro wrestler and nothing else, in the Tokyo Dome in front of over 60,000 people, as part of some stupid Inoki martial arts wrestling tournament thing sponsored by Tighty Whities. He even has to do a press conference. Tony's here in his Miami Heat cap saying that as long as we stay on our feet it'll be okay, and all you get from it is, why the hell am I here? The match is just, well, you have to feel embarrassed for both Stin, who clearly has no idea what to do at all here, and Palmore, who can pretty much do nothing but throw incredibly weak kicks and punches. Yes, they're terrible, but what do you expect from a guy in his 40s who hasn't done any pro wrestling ever in his life? Like, what is he even doing here? Well, he was advertised as a student of Monster Man Everett Eddy, who famously fought and lost to Inoki in a mixed styles match in 1977 that was, naturally, a total work. So presumably he was here to try and face Inoki in the final, get some sort of revenge for his sensei? Who the hell knows? Perhaps Everett Eddy himself was called up for this but was unavailable. Mercifully, it's a short match. It only goes 4.5 and ends with Stin catching a leg and, at last, applying the Scorpion Deathlock to end both this match and indeed Tony Palmore's pro wrestling career. This is the first and last time he stepped into a pro wrestling ring. This is the sort of thing that would make John Boyce very happy. Tony Palmore's is quite possibly the most inconsequential and insignificant pro wrestling career of all time. The other semi-final, by the way, features Antonio Inoki against Gerard Gordeau, a martial artist trained in Savate who UFC fans may know, seeing as he was part of the UFC's very first fight and even got to the final of the original tournament. Now, Gordo actually at least had a couple of shoot-style matches in UWF and Rins under his belt before this, but Inoki jobbed him the hell out in about 2 minutes in a match that was almost as bad as this one. Even the final between Stin and Inoki isn't a good match at all, meaning the whole thing is a total blemish on an otherwise perfectly good card. But then occasional bouts of weirdness like this is what you expect from New Japan back in the 1990s. I mean, look at the bloody guy who's running the show. So next up we have a match featuring two guys who they shouldn't ever be in this sort of video. Rick Rude and Masahiro Chono were both damn good wrestlers after all, but their case is quite unique. How so? Well, it's because when they met for the first time, they had one of the best matches of 1992, a high-profile classic, one of the biggest Japanese matches of the year. Just a couple of months later, they met again on American soil, and they had an absolute stinker. In fact, it was so bad that the readers of the Wrestling Observer voted it the worst match of 1992. No mean feat considering some of the wrestling that was on offer that year. How on earth did such a thing happen? Well, let's take a look. Rude and Chono's first match, in August, was the final of the G1 Climax in New Japan. Both went into the match in top form. Rick Rude was one of the best American heels going, and Chono was one of New Japan's top stars, a brilliant talent who was hitting his prime. They have an absolute barn burner, technically excellent, dramatic as all get out, a fitting tournament final, one of the best matches from, at the time, one of the best promotions. Along with winning the G1 for the second of what would end up being 5 times, Chono also wins the vacant NWA World Heavyweight title, which would be the setup for their rematch in the USA in New Japan's American partner promotion, World Championship Wrestling. So a couple of months later, Chono comes to WCW with the NWA title in tow. He will rematch against Rick Rude at Halloween Havoc 92 with the belt on the line. But, well, there's a few differences. In the main, something's wrong with Chono. On September 23rd, he defended the NWA title in Japan against stunning Steve Austin. 5 minutes in, Austin hits an inverted tombstone on Chono, but the move goes wrong and Chono hits the top of his head on the mat. Now if this is familiar, it's because the exact same thing happened with Austin a few years later, when he broke his neck on an Owen Hart inverted tombstone. Therefore, this incident is thought of as kind of ironic, don't you think? Although contrary to popular belief, this didn't actually break Chono's neck. It was a stinger that gave him a pinched nerve. It would still, however, be a nagging injury that definitely contributed to him changing his style from being a largely technical wrestler to a brawler in a couple of years, and it would certainly limit him severely as a worker for the time being. Chono had almost no time off to heal from the stinger. He was back in the ring 2 weeks later, and then facing Rude on pay-per-view in the USA just over a month afterwards. Chono's pinched nerve is one thing, but it's far from the only bad thing going into this match. After all, we're talking about WCW in late 1992 here, the few months or so when Bill Watts was heading the company and doing all sorts of great things like banning moves from the top rope or pushing his game but utterly unready son Eric. WCW was a confused mess that was heading straight for the edge of a cliff, and this is a prime example. The booking is a total hatchet job that mainly centres around the intense drama over who's going to referee the match, a WCW official or a New Japan one. Bill Watts certainly uses it to get his fizzle on the telly, much to everyone's distress. Here's how awful the continuity and the booking was at the time. On the show itself, there's a segment where Paulie dangerously fires Medusa from the Dangerous Alliance. Medusa turns babyface and kicks him, which in turn sets up another stinker of a match further down the road. So Medusa's a babyface, right? But then, in the very next segment, that being this match, Medusa accompanies Rick Rude to the ring. Rick Rude is pretty much the top heel in the company. So, yeah, that makes absolutely perfect sense, of course. And the intense referee-related drama is settled through a coin toss, meaning that Rude's heel pick of Harley Race referees the match, while that most famous of Japanese refs, Kensuke Sasaki, is the ref on the outside. The dynamic of the match is kind of awkward, really. It was simple enough in the New Japan match where the foreign heel took on the home face with all the marbles on the line, and it made for an utterly molten crowd that really helped the match. Here, in front of a Philadelphia audience, well, we've got the company's top heel, who's already the US champion and had Vader defend his title by proxy earlier on in the show, but let's not even get into that, fighting for a belt that's currently at about the same standing as said belt, against someone that should be a face, but that the American audience doesn't know at all and hasn't been given a chance to know. So in the end, no one gets over. Oh, well, except for Ric Flair. The audience chants "We want Flair" for a big chunk of the match, about a year or so after the Nature Boy jumped ship to the WWF. Nothing good really happens in the ring because Rude and Chono barely get beyond the rudimentaries. Chono is limited, Rude seems annoyed that he isn't as over as he perhaps thought he was, and the crowd are very bored. Chono frequently attempts his STF finisher, but seeing as the crowd don't know the move at all, they barely react to it. It just seems like yet another rest hold, of which there are many over the course of 20 brutal minutes. The crowd does get pretty hyped up close to the end of the match, however this is because a fight broke out in the cheap seats, thus earning everyone's attention. The brilliant production team stays on the hard cam just so you know that everyone in the crowd is looking away from the match. As we build up to the ending, the pair are completely out of sync with whiffs aplenty before we get a typical bullshit finish. Chono knocks Race out of the win with a kick, then throws Rude over the top rope. Rude hits a Rude Awakening and gets a visual pin, but then misses from the top rope. Chono applies the STF, Rude submits, Sasaki gets in the ring, calls for the bell and declares Chono the winner, but then Race reverses the decision and DQs Chono for the throw over the top rope, which is of course illegal in the Watts era. Either way, Chono keeps his belt, so who the bloody hell cares? Fighting ensues, Sasaki attacks, revealing himself to be a wrestler, which, I don't know, I guess they're the heels now? Although Rude is still a heel and so is Harley Race? Who the hell even knows? The crowd is just pissed off at the whole thing because it's such a waste of time. So yeah, all that is how you go from having one of the best matches of the year to having the match that people actually rated the worst. Chono vs Rude beat out luminaries like, for example, Hulk Hogan vs Sid Justice at WrestleMania 8. Hell, it even beat out the infamous Sting vs Jake Roberts spin the wheel make the deal coal miners glove match that occurred on the very same frickin' night, because WCW at the time was a complete and utter hellscape. Halloween Havoc 92 itself won the worst major card of the year in the Observer Awards, and this match was definitely partly to blame. There have been times when a pairing of perfectly good wrestlers have had an off night, even if they're usually good together, or they've at least had good bouts in the past, but I don't think there's ever quite been such a gulf in match quality as there was between Rick Rude and Masahiro Chono's two meetings. It is a shame perhaps that they didn't get some third match together to right this one. Ideally it would have been far, far away from WCW and Bill Watts. Our third and final match is quite famous, and allows us to bookend the video with two bouts of glorious Inoki related action. Because well, let's face it, you can never have enough Inoki. Even the most casual fan might know a thing or two about him, something that feels like a legend. He fought Muhammad Ali to a draw, he headlined the biggest wrestling supercard of all time, he sent out other wrestlers to fight MMA guys, he had a death match on a frickin' island. Unfortunately, all of these things do tend to be significantly less spectacular when you actually see them as opposed to just hearing about them. And to end this video, well, let's talk about that death match on an island. Because of course it isn't a legend, it's something that happened. And my god, it was horrid. The Ganryujima Island deathmatch took place in October 1987 and was actually the culmination to one of Inoki's greatest and most hate-filled feuds, the one against Masa Saito. Now if you don't know Masa, well, he's a big and brutal psychotic monster type wrestler who actually spent most of his career in America, at least until 1985 when he and Ken Patera were sent to jail for beating the shit out of some cops. After his release, Saito made his way back to New Japan and almost immediately got into a feud with Inoki. Makes sense after all, considering his notoriety. The result, for the most part, was frickin' awesome. I mean, I'd recommend just about any Inoki Saito fight. You almost hesitate to call them match except for the Island Deathmatch, because they just flat out brutalise each other for the duration. If you like a good brawl and a good bloodfest, then check them out. And so, after months of violence, the pair choose to settle it all on Ganryujima. So why an Island Deathmatch? And specifically, why here? You have to go a few hundred years back for the reasoning. Ganryujima was the setting for a famous duel between a man named Sasaki Kojiro and a man who would be a Japanese icon, the greatest swordsman of them all, Miyamoto Musashi. The definition of the great Japanese warrior, in other words. You may often wonder about just what Inoki's motivations are for some of the things that he does, for they may seem to be quite off the wall. Well, to understand them you need to look here. In short, Inoki wanted to be considered the modern-day incarnation of Miyamoto Musashi, and the feud with Saito presents a chance to have his own duel to the death on Ganryujima. No pinfalls, no submissions, no referee. The only way to win is to completely incapacitate the opponent. The match itself even starts with a call to the legend. Saito enters the ring to begin the match, but Inoki does not leave his own makeshift tent for another 30 minutes. This is in reference to Musashi purposefully turning up late to the duel with Kojiro in order to frustrate him and gain a mental advantage. Hell, when we first see Inoki, it's almost barely. He's squatting. Honestly, it looks like he's taken a dump in the woods. In any case, the match begins and, well, it's rest holds. Lots of rest holds. Never-ending rest holds. For as much hate as there had been in this feud, well, we get nothing but rest holds here. The whole thing may as well be called Inoki and Saito take a frickin' nap on Ganryujima Island. Needless to say, it gets old quickly. Oh, by the way, this match would end up going for nearly 2 frickin' hours. What I am watching here is a video release of the match that cuts the thing down to about an hour. What I'm saying here is that I'm currently showing you what was deemed to be the highlights of this match. The whole thing has such an odd aesthetic. As much as it's a place of legend, Ganryujima is perhaps less imposing in modern times. It looks like what it is, a small island where a fair bit of industry takes place. The city of Shimonoseki is very noticeable in the background too, which also rather spoils the mystique. Asahi TV made the decision to film the whole thing using very long lenses, the sort you'd use for a nature documentary perhaps. This gives the whole thing a rather shaky, handheld feel, kind of unlike any other wrestling match. And this highlight video has no commentary or music. The only accompaniment to it all is the drone of a chopper flying low, also capturing the match. So yeah, to say the least, it is not the most exciting of things. As day turns to night and flames are lit, things also get harder to see. They do pick up a little closer to the end as the wrestlers actually do start to take bumps, not to mention there being a bit of claret and said flames actually being used as part of the match. So you know, at least there's something for those who have managed to stay awake until this point, so long as they can see it anyway. At last, after the customary big strikes and the enzigiri, Inoki finally chokes Saito into unconsciousness, rendering him the victor. He collapses soon after from the length of this match and the fury of all those rest holds. And there it is, the vaunted Island Deathmatch. It's, different. It actually does have its fans. I suppose you could say there are very, very few things like this. If you were being immensely charitable, you could trace a line from this right here to something like the final deletion. This is an origin to all the things in wrestling that are nowadays called cinema. But then you could say similar things about, I don't know, the Hollywood backlot brawl or the King of the Road match. And this is basically the New Japan version of that, only a few years before. You could say that, as was often the case to be fair, that the somewhat unhinged mind of Antonio Inoki was ahead of its time. But my god, 90% of it is horrendously dull to watch. It is perhaps though the only match that I would kind of recommend here, if only because, well, you ought to see it at least once. if only to say that you've done it, that you know what you're talking about, that you've been around. And there we go. Hopefully you've enjoyed this trio of, well, somewhat intriguing and mostly quite awful Japanese wrestling matches. Sometimes you've just got to have a little laugh at the absurd and the ridiculous. But until the next time, bye for now.